One big question is, what was life like in Texas during the Republic period? Well, one of the things we see during the Republic period is an influx of immigration. In 1836, there were 50,000 settlers in Texas. By 1845, that number had grown to 125,000. What's going to attract a lot of these people is land. Texas had a lot of land, and under the Texas Constitution of 1836, Texas will give out 37 million acres of free land. These will be given out under what are known as headright grants. These are grants of free land issued during the Republic to the head of a household. So if a man would bring his family, he could get free land. What will also attract immigrants, mainly from the United States, is what's known as the Homestead Act of 1839. Many of the early settlers to Texas came because they owed somebody debt in the United States. They owed money to creditors. And under the Homestead Act of 1839, it said that up to 50 acres of land and someone's home were protected from creditors. So if you moved to Texas, you would not have your home taken away by creditors. And so that's going to attract these people. Also, Texas is going to use immigration agents to attract people. They will make contracts with these agents that will allow the agent to make money off of the number of people they can get to move to Texas. A lot of these agents will target the United States, but they'll also be very active in Europe. Now, one is Henry Castro, who's going to work for the German Immigration Company, and he's going to bring over 2,000 people from Germany to Texas. As these immigrants come in, we're going to see different ethnic influences on the culture of Texas. With the Germans, for example, after the first group of Germans arrive in Texas, they're going to encourage others from Germany to move. As a result, they're most going to settle where people from their own country who speak their own language, have their own same culture, already live. So we develop regions that have a strong ethnic influence. We have what's known as the German Belt in south central Texas. This is where the present day town of Fredericksburg is. It was a part of this German belt. And in these cultural influences, you can see the architecture, or see it in architecture and the style of homes that are built and the food that is prevalent there, that is cooked, that is sold, that is served. You see it in the language, the use of more German words for town names, for street names, place names, people's names. You see it in the type of music such as polka and other events, other cultural aspects like that. In the northeast of Texas, the influence is going to be mainly from the United States. The Spanish had not had a very strong presence in the northeast of Texas. For those people that come from the United States that settle this region, agriculture is going to be the main focus of the economy, specifically cotton and wheat. Later, the railroads will come through the area and make northeast Texas a thriving area for commerce. There are lots of natural resources in the area. One of the more unique, interesting resources is at the present day city of Grand Saline, Texas, is going to grow up around a large salt mine, which is still a large working salt mine today. The biggest city that will develop in northeast Texas is the city of Dallas. Started by John Neely Bryan, who ran a ferry crossing on the Trinity River. The town will grow up around his ferry crossing and will become the major city that Dallas is today. Other towns in the Republic are going to develop along rivers because rivers were a major form of shipping and transportation at the time. You could move larger goods quicker along a river. So we see major cities like Beaumont, which is on the Neches River, Waco on the Brazos River, Houston is down at Buffalo Bayou. And then there's the city of Galveston, which will be the major seaport for Texas. And Galveston will be the largest, most important city in Texas for a little bit of time because of its prominence as a major seaport there on the Gulf of Mexico. Other racial and ethnic minorities in Texas were Mexican Texans known as Tejanos. Before the Republic period, most Tejanos lived in the Nacogdoches, San Antonio, Goliad, and Laredo areas, in those specific cities founded by the Spanish. After the Revolution, during the Republic period, though, many Tejanos are going to migrate to Central and South Texas. As Anglos come in from the United States, they come into conflict with the Tejanos. They take their land. As the fighting increases, the Tejanos will move south along the Rio Grande River. This proximity will allow them to continue their Mexican culture. Again, language, specifically Spanish, religion, which was predominantly Catholic, again, holidays, types of food, clothing, things like that are going to continue, which is going to allow that Mexican cultural heritage to be a part of the Texas culture and heritage. But we see also conflict between Tejanos and Anglos, again, as Anglos move further south into the land that they tend to take, try to take the land from the Tejanos who are already there. As far as African Americans go, the majority of African Americans in Texas are slaves, but they are going to influence, the African American influence on the Texas, larger Texas culture is important. The majority, again, of African Americans in Texas are slaves. Stephen F. Austin, when he created the first colony, wanted slavery in Texas. He actively brought in slaves. By 1860, though, a few hundred free African Americans will live in Texas. There were some who were not slaves but were free. The majority, though, again, are slaves because Texas is going to actively restrict the rights of free African Americans. The Texas government says that African Americans cannot be citizens, they cannot legally marry, they cannot be permanent residents of Texas. In 1840, Texas will pass a law saying that all free African Americans who moved to Texas during the Republic period had 2 years to leave, or they would lose their freedom and would be forced to become slaves. The bulk of the people living in Texas made their daily life through farming and ranching. That's how they made their living. It was through agriculture. The majority of Texans lived on small family farms. These consisted of maybe 120 to 160 acres. They mostly raised what were known as subsistence crops. These are crops raised to feed the family living on the land. These were things like corn, sweet potatoes, other vegetables like that. Some land was set aside for what were known as cash crops. A cash crop is a crop that is raised to sell. So cotton was the main cash crop in Texas and is going to govern and influence the Texas economy and culture. While most people lived on small family farms, Texas did have some large plantation farms. These were large farms that focused on cash crops, so again, cotton, but also some sugar cane. The plantation farming was the type of farming Stephen F. Austin encouraged that he brought in from the American South, which focused heavily on or exclusively on the use of slave labor for the farming. These are smaller in number, but because of their size and the income and wealth of these families, they're going to dominate the Texas economy as well as the Texas culture and sort of become a aspiration and goal for people. And these large plantations are mostly in East Texas and South Texas. Another part of the Texas cultural heritage is the ranching. This ranching came from the Spanish legacy, going all the way back to the Spanish explorers, to the originally Spanish colonizers. The term even rancho comes from Spain, where our word ranch comes from. On these ranches, these are farms that raise large numbers of livestock animals, specifically cattle, but also horses and sheep. The Spanish brought large numbers of these animals with them, and then when the Spanish left, when the expeditions like the Coronado expedition ended, they just turned the cattle and the horses loose. And so these served as the foundation for our now Texas Longhorns, but also the wild Mustang herds that would become part of the American West. In Texas ranching, the Texas ranchers will drive their cattle to New Orleans where they will be sold. They will walk them there overland. The big industry in cattle ranching was what was known as the beef and hide trade, that they would have the meat to eat, but also the hide of the cows used for leather, for shoes and other goods like that. And again, the main Texas cow is the Longhorn, which is a mixture of Spanish and English cattle. The Longhorns were smaller than some other breeds of cattle, but they were very hardy and they could survive on the sort of the rough Texas landscape. But cattle weren't the only kind of ranching in Texas. Texas also had a large sheep and goat industry. These are, again, influenced by the Spanish who brought the sheep and goats to Texas, and these animals are raised for wool, but also for their meat and for their milk from the goats, and are still major industries in Texas today. One of the elements that must be discussed is slavery during the Republic of Texas. Texas was a slave economy. That Mexico had forbidden slavery, but Americans continued to bring slaves with them and continued the practice anyway, which was one of the issues that led to Texas declaring its independence from Mexico, was the Texans fighting to keep their slaves, among other things dealing with the loss of rights under Santa Anna. The Republic of Texas will actively encourage and protect slavery. In the Texas Constitution, it will say that you couldn't free your slaves. They made it illegal to try to stop slavery. The cotton industry in Texas is going to be built around plantations and slavery. In 1836, when Texas becomes an independent country, there were 5,000 slaves in Texas. By 1845, when Texas joined the United States, that number had grown to 30,000 slaves. By 1861, at the start of the American Civil War, slaves will account for 1/4 of the Texas population. So 25% of Texans will own slaves, and the slave population will be a large portion of Texas. For slaves' daily life, they were not allowed to marry. They were considered property and not human beings. So the slaves had no legal rights. But on their own, they will form their own families, which there was the overriding stress of these families could be split up at any moment if the owners wanted to sell the families off at any time. And the slave culture will have their own unique culture of music, different types of music and food, again, religion, language, the different arts that will all be combined to create a unique African American culture in Texas, which will influence the larger Texas culture. There was some work in industry in Texas. There were professional and skilled workers. As towns and settlements are going to grow, they're going to need professional services. Specifically, doctors, lawyers, teachers, ministers are going to move to the area. You also need skilled workers as the population grows in these towns and settlements. So people like blacksmiths and carpenters are going to move to Texas. So we see a small, growing professional and skilled group. Other industries will develop. In East Texas, the lumber industry will grow. As people move in and the need for homes arises, you need more wood. And so the lumber industry is going to grow. Sawmills will be built to turn trees into lumber. You have grist mills, which will grind wheat and corn into flour. That the Dallas area in Dallas will have a early economic foundation in these grist mills and these flour mills. And from ranching, you have what's known as the hide and tallow trade. These are leather goods from the hide, but also the tallow is the fat of the animal, which will be used for soap and candles. And as America and Texas, or America and the world becomes more industrial, they will use the fat as grease for these machines. In the 1840s and 1850s, if you were traveling around the Republic of Texas, travel was by roads, and these were generally rough roads, just sort of dirt paths. You were on horse or on wagon. Water travel made it easier, made for better trade, better roads made for the ease of travel, for better trade, the spread of information. It allowed for easier immigration. Texas had problems, though, with their roads. Our roads were very poor. There were large distances between cities. Native Americans in West Texas would attack travelers. And at the water crossings, if you had a ferry, that equaled big money because you had to help, or people had to pay to get across the river. One of the things we see grow in Texas is the need for railroads. Railroads allow you to move goods cheaper and faster. You can move a large amount of goods and people, again, further distances a lot faster and cheaper. And so railroads are going to be the key to economic growth in the United States. But railroads cost money, it takes time to build them, and it takes labor to build the railroads. Texas will not get its first railroad until 1853, after Texas becomes a state in the United States. And by the time of the Civil War, Texas will only have 9 railroads and only 470 miles of track in Texas. As far as communication goes among the people living in Texas, it's going to be mostly by mail, through written letters, but also there were newspapers. These are the only forms of news. The telegraph will be invented by Samuel Morse in the 1840, which will allow for instantaneous communication but Texas will not receive its first telegraph until 1854, so 14 years after Morris's invention. For the people living in the Republic of Texas, their social and domestic lives were dominated generally by farm work. Since most people lived on isolated farms, their life revolved around the farm schedule. What socialization there was also revolved around the work schedule of an agricultural life. You had the harvest where families would help each other to bring their crops in. This also allowed for celebrations and interactions. You would have hunting and fishing, which were social activities, but also were pragmatic because it allowed for providing food for the families. These were usually activities for males. You had what were called quilting bees for women, where they would come together to make a quilt, which was then practical to keep people warm in the winter, but also allowed for socialization. The births, weddings, all of these were other ways that women could socialize. Dances were a very popular part of social gatherings, usually continuing maybe traditional dances if they were immigrants from another country, or folk dances, things like that. Religion in the Republic of Texas, Catholicism is still a main religion. It was the main one before the Revolution. Both Spain and Mexico required people to be Catholic. After the Revolution, the Constitution of 1836 will give freedom of religion, and we start to see other Protestant groups now moving in. So Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran will move to Texas and establish churches. As far as the health of people living in the Republic of Texas, there were very few doctors, very little chance to get a formal medical attention. So most people, when you got sick, it was by home remedies, medical care that was passed down through the families, natural remedies, things like that. For the birth of babies, it was usually a midwife who would deliver the baby, not a doctor. And as far as education, again, the first public school system in Texas is going to start in the 1840s. Up until then, it was education for children was done either at the home by the family, or the kids might not receive an education. If the family was wealthy, they could maybe hire a private tutor. But it's in 1840 that we start to see our first public school system in Texas. And so for the years that Texas was a republic, that's what life was like in an overview for the people living in the republic.